Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Please welcome Managing Director, Global Futures Group, Simon Sylvester Chowdhury.
Welcome everybody to the second day of Smart Cities NYC. I'm Simon Sylvester Chowdhury, Managing Director of Global Futures Group and one of the producers of the show. I can tell that a few of you maybe were at the HITM party a little late last night, maybe had a little bit too much tequila and are still coming in, but I'm pretty confident that we're going to have a full house for this really power panel that's going to come on after me. Yesterday was phenomenal for those of you who are here. Tony Towns-Whitley from Microsoft gave just an amazing speech, spoke about really the emergence of the civic world and hospitals and medicine and education into smart cities and really kind of changing what smart cities means, which is really important to us. I don't know if you saw Robert Wolf, he had a drone fly up. That was pretty cool. We had great conversations on blockchain, people with disabilities, and overall just a fantastic day, a number of workshops that were just amazing and packed houses. So want to thank everyone that participated yesterday. A couple housekeeping notes. For those of you coming from abroad who had difficulties, we brought in some ATMs, so you'll be able to have better access to the food trucks. Lyft has provided us with a generous code, so if you use Smart Cities, you'll have access to that. I know a lot of you will be going up to the Urban X event afterwards in Greenpoint, and so we'll have lifts over at the Sand Street entrance, and please use the code Smart Cities. Keep checking your emails. I know our team is rapidly sending you information emails. As you can imagine, as amazing as the amazing Brooklyn Navy Yard's 300 acres, so there are a lot of logistics, so sometimes things come up, so definitely keep checking your emails. And then speak to the folks with the yellow shirts if you have any questions, and if they can't address them, they'll definitely find the right people that can. Today, we also have another great day. We have 8 more workshops left. We're doing a Managing Internet of Things workshop with the Mayor's Office of Technology and Innovation. I know a number of our CTOs and CIOs are participating in that one. CivLab, as well as City Digital from Chicago and New York City's Urban Tech Hub will also be doing a great workshop. Some things that I'm personally looking forward to. We've been speaking and working with the folks up in Vancouver and Mayor Robertson, and he's going to have a fantastic conversation with Brendan Shane, the North American Director of C40, and they won the C40 City of the Year last year, so that's fantastic. Columbus goes electric. We're going to have Vice Chairman of Deloitte, Mark Price, interview the team from Columbus that won the DOT Challenge, and I know a lot of cities out there are really looking forward to that. I'm particularly looking forward to it because Columbus is important to my heart because that's where I was created, that's where my parents met, so I'm really looking forward to that one. And then we have a great infrastructure panel coming up next. We have some folks from Goldman, Macquarie, Tom Wright from the RPA is going to be moderating, so I'm really looking forward to introducing them. Just kind of closing notes, we had a lot of great discussions yesterday and got to go to the New Lab party last night, went to the HITM party last night. I don't know if folks were there, but we had an awesome Colombian band and arepas. But a lot of the conversations were really inspiring to me, and it's a lot about what one of our goals when we created this show was, we really didn't know what to name the show, so we kept with the narrative of smart cities. And we said, well, if we can't change the name of smart cities, let's change what smart cities means. And so I really want to challenge everybody out there today, whether it's speaking in the forum, going to the workshops, participating, if you're on stage, to really think what smart cities means, but also think what smart cities can mean and how it's impacting citizens, and whether it's from the nonprofit angle or the academic angle or the private sector angle and the government angle. So I hope you guys really enjoy today. It looks like we have some more beautiful weather. And yeah, have a great day. And so you're gonna have a great panel afterwards, and we'll see you throughout the day. Take care.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome President, Regional Plan Association, Tom Wright.
Hi. Thanks everyone for joining us this morning. I've got the pleasure of moderating a panel to talk about large infrastructure projects. I'm going to bring out my panelists and then kind of tee up some issues. First, I'm pleased to welcome Pat Foy, a good friend. Pat's the Executive Director of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Tony Kosha, the Chairman of Amtrak, also former Chair of the Port Authority, working on just a couple little projects these days. Michael Evans, who runs the Moynihan Station Development Corporation, which is building a new train hall over on the west side, and Ed Pallison with Goldman Sachs to help kind of figure out how we can pay for things. So thanks everybody for joining. Let's take a seat and kind of dig into it. I think the theme for this panel is to talk about large-scale infrastructure projects. And I think all of us know that around the world, we all travel. We were just talking about adventures in Australia and other parts of the world. And what we're seeing kind of globally, I would say, is there's a generation of enormous amounts of infrastructure investment happening. We all know about the Asian cities and what's going on, but even London building the Crossrail system, Paris upgrading its subways, airports all over the world being expanded and other things. We all talk about, and at RPA, we're kind of looking at a future with potentially real enormous growth, much of it centered here in the New York City region, and we worry about constraints on our ability to continue to grow, prosper, if we don't add capacity to our systems. And kind of part of the way we look at the world is that we've been growing based on the capacity and the investments that were made by prior generations. I think the interesting thing for us here in New York is that, in fact, there are major investment projects underway in various phases, and three of you here are in charge of delivering some of those. So what I'd like to do is kind of talk a little bit about kind of what is the status of those projects, what are the opportunities and challenges each of them has. Also, since many of them are interrelated, of course, you can't talk about, perhaps the single most important project we think in the entire country right now is building a new tunnel under the Hudson River. You can't do that without having a station for people to get off at, and the Port Authority, of course, is the agency that kind of governs the Hudson River. So maybe to talk a little about that. And then Ed, maybe I'll ask you to kind of talk about how it is that we're going to pay for these things, what's being done in other parts of the world, and in particular, kind of, are there things that we should be doing that we're not, would be the way I'd open it up. So Pat, if I could ask you first just to kind of provide a little bit of an overview of what the Port Authority's up to, the major projects, and kind of where you see them going, what people should be looking for in the next year or two.
Sure, thanks Tom. So just a bit of context. On a national basis, it's estimated that the infrastructure investment deficit over decades is $1 to $2 trillion. That's trillion with a T. That's a shockingly high amount of money given the national economy, 16 or 17 trillion dollars. And that investment deficit is across the country, this region, New York State, New Jersey, New York City, et cetera. Port Authority Board approved the $32 billion capital plan in February, and I'll talk about a couple of those projects and how we're attacking them. And I'll leave to my colleague Tony Kosha the discussion about Gateway, which is the most important infrastructure project in the country that simply must happen. And if it doesn't happen, it's an economic, transportation, and environmental disaster. And I'll defer to Tony on that. So at the Port Authority, the approach we've been taking to an increasing degree is public-private partnerships, design, build, and doing transactions where we're taking advantage of private capital, private expertise, and capping the public sector, the Port Authority's exposure. We've done that so far to the extent of about $9.5 billion. It's not exactly apples to apples, but $9.5 billion in the $32 billion capital plan. And I'll just tick off a couple of those and then talk about, next month we're going to open the first lanes on the Goethals Bridge, a new Goethals Bridge. It's a $1.5 billion public-private partnership. It's going to open in June. Project's on time. If it runs over, it's not on us, it's on the developer, but we don't expect that to happen, and the project's about 80% done. First surface transportation public-private partnership done in the Northeast. At LaGuardia, anybody who's flown into LaGuardia recently has seen a tremendous amount, soon to be about $100 million of work at what is now the Central Terminal building. Will be Terminal B when it's completed, largest public-private partnership in the history of the country, about $4.2 billion, being done by a group called LaGuardia Gateway Partners, picked in a robust competitive RFP. That's a consortia of Vantage, which is an international airport management company, Meridium, a French European infrastructure fund, and then Skanska, which is a AAA world-class construction firm, which is both building together with its construction partner Walsh, but is also an equity investor. That project, $4.2 billion. First concourses will open this time next year. If you're flying in and out of LaGuardia or driving past on the Grand Central Parkway, you can see that work. On the east end of LaGuardia, while it's not a public-private partnership, we've made a similar deal with Delta Airlines, similar in the extent that the public sector, the Port Authority's exposure is limited. Delta is going to invest north of $4 billion to build new terminals on the east end of the airport. The Port Authority's exposure on that transaction is also capped. We're going to make a $600 million commitment. That's in the capital plan, $200 into the terminal, $400 into the infrastructure. Delta is very good at managing complex construction projects in this part of the country and elsewhere, but if it were to go over, that's on Delta, just like the same arrangement we've got at the Goethals Bridge and with the LaGuardia Gateway Partners at LaGuardia. At Newark Airport, we're going to be building a new Terminal A. That's not being done as a P3, it's being done as a design-build transaction. The approach we're taking at P3s is every project of $500 million or over, we're going to look at, examine carefully whether it can be done as a P3. Most of them won't. At Terminal A at Newark, which is a substantially, no construction's simple or easy or risk-free in this part of the country or any place for that reason. But we're going to do Terminal A as a design-build. It's in effect, a greenfield construction project because it's not being done on the site, unlike LaGuardia, the site of the existing terminal. We're also in the planning stage for a new Port Authority bus terminal, 42nd Street and 8th Avenue. The capital plan includes $3.5 billion for the bus terminal. We're going to be issuing RFPs for planning and environmental and construction analysis, and that work has been going on some time. Port Authority ran a design and deliverability competition in the last 12 months, and what we do is going to be informed by that competition. The possibility of building at the existing site is also being seriously pursued, although no judgments have been made on that. And then lastly, I'll note the Port Authority Board approved the payment of debt service on $2.7 billion of low-cost RIF. RIF is a U.S. DOT low-cost financing program for transportation. It's really well suited to transportation projects for a number of reasons. The Port Authority Board committed to pay debt service on $2.7 billion, which is about half the local share on the Hudson Tunnel and the other pieces. So Tom, that's a quick summary, and I'll leave the rest of the gateway to Tony.
It's a pretty amazing list. I mean, it's an extraordinary array.
And it's a partial list.
And only a partial list of things that are moving forward. Now, as you kind of finished with the big project, Gateway,
all right.
Tony, kind of where do you see at Amtrak trying to drive that?
Sure. Let me. I mean, hopefully we're going to get a chance to talk a little bit about Gateway and why it's important and where we stand and what sort of needs to be done for us to actually build additional Trans-Hudson capacity to create greater ability to get in and out of New York City and hopefully preserve New York City's economic position globally, which this transaction is nothing less than that. But let me kind of zoom out a bit, because I think sometimes we really get focused on we're building a tunnel under the Hudson River for additional train capacity. There's no simpler way of putting it, but let me zoom out a little bit to sort of tell you what I think this is all about, and I think there are quite a few people who agree with it. Mobility is a really important thing. The ability to get from here to there can have an impact not just on your economic opportunity, but on the quality of your life and a whole variety of things. Amtrak, as basically the country's only national passenger rail system, sort of inherited an environment where for probably about the first 35 to 40 years of Amtrak's existence, no one was really sure how passenger rail really played into mobility. Was it really important? People were using aviation far greater. Americans have an affinity for their cars. We built an interstate highway system. Passenger rail, to some degree, was starting to look like, particularly intercity passenger rail, was starting to look like a bit of an orphan. But as time went by, something happened that certainly all of those who are here today are here because this is an area of interest. People started to reimagine how cities could operate. The incredible migration of people back out of suburbs and into cities created this incredible demand for finding the most effective way to get from point A to point B. So for the first time in several generations, there is now this push to try to create reliable, effective intercity rail travel. The ability to get from one spot to another using a train that avoids, in certain distances, the difficulties that sometimes are associated with air travel, gets congestion off of highways. People are concerned about the sustainability footprint that they're creating and what that encounters, and creating a much more efficient transportation system. Amtrak finds itself right in the middle of this discussion. And in the last 3 or 4 years, there have been dramatic levels of change at Amtrak in order to accommodate that city-to-city business that provides the kind of opportunity for people who want to travel on trains because it gives them a much more effective way to get between places. But the issue, and Pat sort of alluded to this, is that for decades we've underinvested in the nation's rail system. And in no place is that underinvestment more apparent than here in New York, where we rely on it so heavily. So we have a long list of things that have to be done, and Gateway is right at the top of that list. The Gateway project represents nothing less dramatic than preserving passenger rail for the Northeast Corridor of the United States. The economic region that is most critical to the country's growth in GDP is entirely reliant on our ability to be able to create this kind of mobility option that we think keeps the region competitive and allows for the country's economy to grow. Now, there had been multiple attempts to try to solve this problem, as many of you may know. And in 2011, Amtrak sort of relaunched this program as the Gateway program, because Amtrak engineers and designers came up with an alignment that created direct access to Penn Station and also created interoperability between Amtrak's national lines and the commuters, New Jersey Transit, and an ability to integrate with what Long Island Railroad does. A far superior design for this program that had ever really been conceived. But at the time, it was sort of Amtrak acting by itself to try to advance the Gateway program. We invested what little capital we could in advancing the design of that, but what really kind of brought it to a head, and it allows me to create the great platform for where we are now, is that in the summer of 2015, after several years of design work that we thought had advanced a really practical, reliable design for how we can expand rail travel in and out of New York City, despite all of the things we had done to try to encourage people to get behind this initiative, to commit the kind of resources necessary to make train travel in and out of New York City better, the thing that helped us the most is that in the summer of 2015, not unlike the period we have just gone through, there were significant problems at Penn Station getting in and out of New York City. It was July, it was really hot, people were stuck on platforms, lots of aggravated commuters, lots of aggravated passengers. Certainly people in the political world took notice of all of this, lots of things being flung back and forth. But as a result of that difficult summer, and people basically trying to make a system work that was designed for 1/10 the capacity that it's currently handling, a real momentum built around the Gateway program. The Port Authority, and Pat has been a tremendous partner in this, stepped up in a very big way to provide an enormous amount of support. Both the state of New York and New Jersey and the US DOT came together to form the Gateway Development Corporation, and I'm pleased to say that we've made significant progress since then at advancing what, as Pat accurately described, as the nation's most critical infrastructure project. The first phase of that project, building the Portal Bridge, which goes over the Hackensack River, and believe it or not, it's an over 100-year-old structure. It's a lift bridge so that maritime traffic can go underneath it, and as you would imagine, anything built 100 years ago, when you lift it, sometimes it doesn't come down the way it should. That needs to be replaced. We're well on the way toward being able to start that project. We think by this summer we'll be able to begin the initial phase of some of the work on that project. The actual tunnels themselves, We're in an expedited environmental permitting process. We expect the first preliminary report to be issued this summer, and we expect final approvals by next spring. And we are aggressively working on putting together a plan of finance to make that project a reality. As Pat mentioned, the Port Authority has committed significant amounts of capital to this. Amtrak has. Both New York and New Jersey have been very supportive. And we're encouraged that all the discussion out of Washington about investing in infrastructure, that Gateway will clearly be a big winner in that project. So we're optimistic that we are turning a corner and turning a really positive corner toward creating a real future for the Gateway program, but really a future for creating a more efficient, effective, reliable rail passenger system in the United States.
That's great. Thank you, Tony, for that overview and how far it's come. As somebody who's commuted under the river for almost 20 years now and known the difference. At RPA, we look at the entire tri-state metropolitan area, and I'll just throw out kind of two numbers that are powerful for us. One from 1975 to 2005, 9 out of every 10 jobs created in the entire metro region were outside the 5 boroughs of New York City. For an entire generation, essentially, the job growth in this metropolitan region was in northern New Jersey and Fairfield, Connecticut, outside New York City. For the last 10 years, 9 out of 10 new jobs created in this region have been inside New York City. New York has seen its employment grow by almost 20% in a little bit more than 10 years. And fueling that and keeping that economic engine going is enormously critical. At the same time, we like to point out over the last generation, when a job is created in New York City, the person working there either lives in New York City or outside New York City. And obviously the city can't house all the people that are working here. And when you look at the tri-state region, essentially Long Island is the same number of people on Long Island work in jobs in New York today as did a generation ago. About 5,000 additional people commute from Connecticut, about 7,000 additional people commute from the Hudson Valley, and almost 70,000 people commute from New Jersey into jobs in New York City. The commuter shed, the growth has been over the last generation across the Hudson River. And so what Tony's talking about is, absolutely critical to this region. Now, when the people come in take the train in, Penn Station, and there are editorials today in 2 of the major newspapers talking about issues there, and let's face it, it's been a tough spring already for commuters into Penn Station, and I think Amtrak is doing the right thing in planning to kind of rip the Band-Aid off later this summer and try and make some repairs. But part of the goal is to improve the commuter experience and provide a destination for them that's worthy of people. And Moynihan Station across 8th Avenue from Penn Station is a critical piece to that and has been moving forward. In some ways, I think, Michael, kind of below the radar. People might not really be aware of what's happening there. Could you kind of give us an update on that and where it fits into this?
Yes, thank you, Tom. As Tom said, people have to come into a station, and where they come in today is completely inadequate. It's inadequate in every dimension, certainly as a kind of customer service experience, as a gateway to the greatest city in the country. It's also just inadequate from a life safety perspective, from overcrowding, from anyone who has waited for a train, who has done that kind of cattle call at rush hour. And it's inadequate for the commuter railroads, it's inadequate for Amtrak, and it requires a major fix. And it especially requires a fix with all of these other investments into the facility and in getting people into the facility that are now planned and moving forward, as Tony described. So we like to see the Moynihan Station project as one part of the broader Gateway vision. And it's moving forward. The very first phase, which is an underground concourse west of 8th Avenue, will be opening shortly this spring. And the second phase is gone through its final round of public approvals, and early work has already begun within the building in terms of early construction, and major construction will be starting shortly. This is an exciting moment because it's a long deferred dream. But I think it's important to note that I think one of the reasons it had been a long deferred dream is that originally it was about atoning for the destruction of the original Pennsylvania station. It was a historic preservation project. It got a lot of great editorials, it got a lot of historic preservationists excited, but it had, the transportation utility had not really been thought through. And I think that now, through a lot of hard work with Amtrak, with Long Island Railroad, with New Jersey Transit, a lot of thinking about how to make sure this project is part of the solution for the overall Penn Station capacity constraint that is being addressed has been an important element that has gotten it to the point where it's ready to move forward and to help relieve all of that congestion that happens at the concourse level. We're going to be nearly doubling the amount of concourse space by expanding the existing Penn Station west towards 9th Avenue, and it's dramatically needed, not just because of new tunnels, but because essentially a new city is being built on the far west side of Manhattan, and the infrastructure, transportation infrastructure investment needed to service that needs to take place. And so by moving Amtrak to an entire purpose-built train hall, that's one step. We will also be expanding the Long Island Railroad presence west towards 9th Avenue to meet that demand of the far west side. And it's all working together with the longer term investments that Tony described. And I would just say that the focus on transportation and making sure that the Farley-Moynihan project addresses a transportation need has been critical, and I think it shows the role of government in these projects. I think in many cases, the private sector, which we're going to talk about, has an important role to help jumpstart things, to help with financing, but government has to play a particular role. And in this project, its major role has been focusing the policymakers and focusing resources on the public investment. In past years, the project had been more of a real estate development play, more of an economic development initiative, a historic preservation initiative, and I think what was really critical to get it moving into the execution phase was for the government, and especially under the leadership of Governor Cuomo, to focus in on the transportation rationale, which justified the great public investment in this project. Mm-hmm. And it was only possible by working very closely with Amtrak, with Long Island Railroad, with the Port Authority, and New Jersey Transit.
Great. Well, that's a great maybe segue, Ed. Hearing three public officials talk about the projects. Of course, to get any of this done will require an enormous amount of money. Pat in particular talked about the public-private partnership model and ways to do that. Kind of from your perspective, and look, the challenge anytime I try and, around a dinner table or with friends describe what I do, what they'll say is that all sounds nice, but nobody wants to pay for it. There's not enough money. We all just, there's a kind of assumption that just there's no way to pay for any of these kinds of things. But you do manage somehow to find money for these types of investments or in other parts of the world. What's your kind of perspective on what's happening here in New York in particular? Do you think that these projects are attractive? Are there revenue streams? Are there models that we are using or that we should be using to try to deliver these things?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. So there's some good news in here, which is really money is not the problem. Capital is not the problem for critical infrastructure projects. We, in our fund, which I help run at Goldman Sachs, we invest globally, so we have a good global perspective on what works and what doesn't, and we manage money, if you will, for big institutional investors around the world. And I can tell you without any hesitancy or equivocation that the biggest institutional investors in the world would absolutely love to be invested in critical infrastructure in the United States and in particular in New York City. There is no place that is more attractive to very large pools of capital. So the issue is rather, how do you have well-structured projects that can attract private capital with the right risk profile? And I agree with what we've talked about so far, which is government has a very critical role to play in presenting, if you will, a project that's ready to be financeable by the private sector. And that is not an easy thing. That is very, very hard to do. When you think about things around, and all of these have a social purpose, but environmental permitting, political log jams, diffuse decision-making authority, stakeholders in the community, the list goes on and on. All of that kind of stuff gives big institutional investors a headache and causes them to think, life's too short, I'm going to go somewhere else. So I think that the focus for all of us in the community who are interested in this is thinking if we do want to leverage private capital, and I think there's a massive need for it in many projects, it really is around trying to have a streamlined, concrete set of proposals that people can evaluate, underwrite, and take on risk. And there should be a quid pro quo, which is there should be real risk transfer to the private sector. This should not be something where the private sector is quote unquote getting infrastructure for free and people are selling off the crown jewels. That can be a politically sensitive topic, and it should be. The private sector is well equipped to take real risk transfer. And I would say of the projects we've talked about, Pat's projects are farthest along, and I think Pat and the Port Authority, although they've had their challenges, I mean, it is a political animal. There's been lots of political sensitivity. There have been stops and starts. I think they've done an outstanding job of driving projects along, and sooner rather than later, we're going to have a world-class facility at LaGuardia, and who could have even thought that 3 or 4 years ago? LaGuardia was a joke to anyone who traveled through there. So the Port Authority's done an excellent job. But I think that my bottom line would be if people really do have the wherewithal to set up projects in a way that does attract private capital, the private capital will be there.
Yeah.
Okay, can I just jump in? I agree with everything Ed has said, and the Goldman Fund is one of the leading and most successful infrastructure funds around. I think 2 points are worth making. One is it's a lot easier to do public-private partnerships where there's a source of revenue associated with the asset. Airports, for instance, airports like JFK, Newark, LaGuardia generate significant amount of cash flow and have a thing called PFCs, which is a passenger facility charge on each ticket. There's about $1 billion of PFCs in LaGuardia. Public-private partnership. Assets that don't have recurring sustainable sources of revenue, it's tougher to do reality. The second point I think I'd make on behalf of both Tony and I is that Gateway, we're going to look, we're partners on Gateway together with New Jersey Transit and US DOT, as Tony mentioned. We're going to look at public-private partnership opportunities for pieces of Gateway, certainly, and that's something that I think each of the partners are committed to. But given the essential, vital nature of Gateway and the fact that if the existing tunnels were to collapse before the new tunnels were built, it is incumbent upon the federal government to put a significant amount of both grant money and low-cost loan money together with whatever private capital is deployed. And without literally billions of dollars of both federal grant, new starts, or whatever other programs the Congress and the administration and DOT may create, and without billions of dollars of low cost, whether it's TIFIA, which is the loan program we used on the Goethals Bridge, or RIF, which is a loan program that Amtrak and the MTA have used, there will be no Gateway. And I just thought it was important, Tom, to make that point.
Well, and I was going to kind of ask you, Tony, to pick up on this, and that is something in my mind too. The way I look at these also, I mean, airports, as you said, Pat, they are very profitable ventures, and so of course there's a way to try and identify those profits and target them and use them as financing schemes. Now, something like a tunnel under the Hudson River, who the beneficiaries run literally from Vermont to Maine to Virginia, let's say, and it's a very diffuse but very, very large set. It's kind of harder to identify. Does that mean that what we ought to do is to try and rely more on the public sector, or are there still strategies to try to carve out some of these?
Yeah, I think there are multiple strategies to bring private capital into the Gateway program in various different levels. But what Pat said is accurate, which is that all the stakeholders, both public and private, are going to have to play a significant role in creating the kind of financial resources that are going to be necessary for this. But sort of inherent in that is the real opportunity here, which is that we're all talking about how there are so many infrastructure projects that need to get done, and we've had real difficulty doing it. And Ed made a great point, which is to say there probably is a lot of money out there in private resources, and there are significant public resources that could be made available. But the single biggest sort of impediment to that, in my view, is the execution risk that's out there. Whether it's the public investor, which ultimately represents taxpayers, or it's a private investor, represented by whatever funds are looking to get exposure in the infrastructure space, there needs to be a higher level of confidence that the projects that we're talking about are actually going to get well-designed, started on time, finished on time, stick to budget, accomplish the kind of things that they want. We have not really generated the kind of confidence in both the public and private sector to create the kind of support that's necessary for these projects. So Gateway, in many ways, does represent an opportunity for us to take on something that most people believe is going to cost in excess of $20 billion. No one doubts how critical it is. No one doubts that the economic return in terms of what it generates in value to the economy far exceeds its costs. Everyone knows this is a smart idea, it should be done, and all the things that generally would be associated with a positive initiative are attributable here, but they sort of want to know, well, how's this actually going to happen? So in Gateway, we have an opportunity to take government at different levels, in different geographic and political jurisdictions, and mix it with the private sector, and create, hopefully, a whole new paradigm for how the public and private sector intersect in order to take on an initiative that isn't going to get done in a year. I mean, under ideal circumstances, it will take a decade to complete this project. So we do not have institutions today that have the ability to take on a project that's going to cost over $20 billion and take over 10 years to build, that engender the kind of confidence that taxpayers believe their money's being well spent and investors believe that their money's being well invested. So Gateway gives us the chance to do this right. And we are working very hard on trying to create around the Gateway Development Corporation what basically represents a whole new paradigm for how you take on significant infrastructure projects where you need partnerships from people from different levels within government, different geographic jurisdictions, and also people who come and bring a private perspective into this. And so, in a way, this is really a chance for us to get this right. It really is.
Yeah.
We've been talking about the need for additional capacity for travelers, but I think what Tony's talking about, which is equally important, is just the capacity of the entities and the agencies that are undertaking these projects to be able to do them. And I think that capacity in many cases was lost. I mean, the Port Authority built those great tunnels under the Hudson River. The Pennsylvania Railroad built the original tunnels under the Hudson River. But there was, in the post-war period, a real disinvestment in these agencies and in these types of projects. And that has to be rebuilt, and it doesn't happen overnight. And you need funding to do that, and you need reliable funding. It's very hard to build that institutional capacity if every year you're worried that Congress is going to slice your budget to zero, or you have to go back to the legislature for an appropriation to fund your agency. So I think building that institutional capacity is critical, and we have seen other cities that lost it rebuild it. You mentioned London and Paris. I mean, look at the Crossrail project. It's not been without its problems, but they've gone from underinvesting in that kind of infrastructure to now having, essentially being where the US might look for that kind of expertise.
Yeah. I mean, as you were talking, Tony, I'm thinking, I'm sure Pat's aware, in about 4 years you'll be celebrating the centennial of the Port Authority. And
You're all invited.
and it's an institutional model that wasn't in 5 years. I'll be celebrating the centennial at RPA. You're all invited. But it was kind of, the creation of the modern public authority is now coming up on a century. And not just kind of, I'll throw out there institutional capacity, but kind of governance structure and where kind of the responsibility lies. As Michael's saying, I mean, London has done an extraordinary amount after restructuring its entire city government and creating a new public authority essentially to govern its infrastructure less than 20 years ago. And Tony, I think you're right that the Gateway Development Corporation, which is going to become some new type of institutional entity to receive federal and local match funding and to plan and implement and build enormous systems, is kind of our chance to get something right. Maybe Ed, if I'll put you on the spot for the last comment, if you've looked around since you kind of, I assume that as part of the financial analysis, you look at the institutional structures that you're talking about. What kind of advice would you give for the creation of a new Gateway Development Corporation? What powers, is there one critical thing or a few things that it needs to have to succeed in your mind?
Here I would say, of course there are things, and I'll mention a couple, but here I'm a little more on the pessimistic side in the sense that in this country, one thing that is very different about this country from most other countries that have had, large and very effective infrastructure programs is we have a federal system. And that's baked in the cake pretty deeply. That's in the US Constitution. And it was designed to be diffuse and have different centers of power and have things where it's difficult to get things done. And you know what? It's difficult to get things done. And that's kind of in the design of our system. So most of the infrastructure in this country is not controlled by the federal government. It's controlled by states, localities, municipalities, public authorities. And that's just not going to go away. Now, having said that, I do think having agencies where you have real political buy-in, that have discretion and don't need to go back and check with stakeholders at every step of the way. You have kind of a beginning, a middle, and an end to the process, and they're equipped to do it with the relevant oversight and enabling authorities. I think that's really the most simple thing. It's a high-level comment, but the more times that you have a process that needs to go back to say, okay, do we really want to do this? Do we really mean it? After people have spent years and millions of dollars in developing, that's toxic. And I think some of the public authorities are farther along in that dimension than others. And I think in the US it's never going to be perfect, but I think there are some models to do it better than we have historically.
That's great. So as a final comment, it's not just about the money, but the structure too. Will you please join me in thanking this terrific panel? I hope you enjoyed that.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome CEO, the Stewart Group, Leisha Stewart.
Busy. It's busy out there. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Leisha Stewart, and it's really my honor and pleasure to be here to help guide this discussion today. For this session, we're going to be talking about transit and how we're really rethinking the role of transit in smart cities. The cities that get it right will no doubt be the ones that emerge as the economic and the social leaders in the world. Currently, just looking at this statistics, more than half the world's population live in cities. And within 50 years, more than 70% of the world's population will live in cities. So this means more people in denser urban environments with a need to travel, resulting in greater congestion and longer commutes. So innovations in public transit and transport telematics are one way that we can ensure that cities remain efficient and productive. Telematics has been around for a while, as we know. Who in the room remembers when, to much fanfare, General Motors launched their OnStar feature in cars? Obsolete now, right? But that's how fast it's moving. So from those really early days as an aid to navigation for car drivers, that technology is being pushed from people in vehicles to people on street corners. And those people are trying to decide whether they should call for an Uber, head down to the subway, jump on a bike share, or perhaps just walk to their destination. Maybe even a combination of all modes. So telematics is going to be the vital link to creating smart cities, and it's now easier with greater access to mobile than ever. As president of the Stewart Group, our business is all about strategy for large and complex transit initiatives. And with the help of our panel today, we're going to explore some of the latest innovations for transit and discuss their use and effectiveness. We've assembled a terrific panel of some of North America's leading experts in this field. And let me introduce them to you before we get into the meat of our discussion. Our first guest, Andy Taylor, is the Director of Strategy with Cubic Transportation Systems. This is an organization I know well, given that welcome, Andy. Just a year ago, they launched a smart card in Vancouver, British Columbia, known as the Compass Card. And within 1 year, 96% of all transit trips in Metro Vancouver are made with the Compass card. But better yet, transit ridership is up almost 5% in a single year. So here's a case. Give people the technology, make it easy for them to use the service, and more people use it. Pretty simple application, pretty stunning results. Welcome.
Thank you.
Our next guest is Scott Sharon, who's joining us from Alstom, where he is the Vice President of Marketing and Strategy. Many people in the room here will know Alstom as the supplier of the high-speed trains, the Acela Express, that run between Boston, Washington, and New York. Anybody ride that train? Do you love the service? It's fantastic. Well, they've just been awarded a contract to build the next generation of high-speed trains, and Andy's going to share some of the details about that. Scott, rather, is going to share the details for us on that exciting new order. Now, our next guest is Robert Galvin. He's the Chief Technology Officer of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And as you know, the Port Authority has all kinds of critical rail infrastructure, bridges, tunnels, airports, seaports. And if we're going to have a smart city, these guys need to lead the way. And finally, someone that I know quite well, Adam Jambroni, who's the current director of the Brooklyn Queens Connector, BQX. Adam is actually also the former chair of the Toronto Transit Commission, second largest transit system in the United States and Canada. And Adam is really what we call a Canadian on loan. We're happy to have him here in your city for a while, but we'd like him back when he's finished. Welcome, Adam. So, without much further ado, I think we'll just get right into the questions. I really felt the way to start this morning was just to talk about what is the role of transit in a smart city and how has it evolved over time? Scott.
Thank you, Leisha. So, when we at Alstom think about smart cities, we ask ourselves, what is a smart city? And we really think smart cities need to think of themselves as a product. And they need to figure out how to make that product as marketable to people as possible. And you can do that through having a good, efficient public transportation system and transit system, so people don't mind being in the city and it's easy to navigate through the city. But they also need to think about how to attract and bring people into that city and make it easily accessible. And that's really where high-speed rail comes in. You have commuter lines that connect the city to the immediately adjacent communities, but a smart city needs to think bigger. It needs to think about how does it reduce the amount of time to connect further out communities that in the past may have seemed too far, but even though geographic distance may be far, how do you compress the time and link them more closely together in time? Amtrak has taken the step to buy 28 new high-speed trains that can operate much faster than the current Acela without updating the infrastructure. They're going to be able to do that by having these trains tilt so they can go through the existing curves much faster. But also, probably most importantly, they're going to increase the frequency. During rush hour, the trains are going to be able to operate every half hour as opposed to every hour. So you're creating a transit asset that you basically don't need a ticket anymore. You can show up at the station and know that within 30 minutes you can hop on a train and get into New York City or Washington, D.C., or Boston, or Philadelphia, or Baltimore, or any of the other cities along the lines. So it's about thinking about yourself as a product, utilizing transit as a major asset to make that product attractive for people to want to be in that smart city, and then providing access to that city from the surrounding communities and even to the distant communities so that they're able to access and take advantage of your smart city.
Great. Adam, you ran a public authority. Tell us how transit has evolved.
So, I mean, thinking here in New York and many of the large cities in the US, Canada, and around the world, transit started out as being a great equalizer. It was for everybody. Everybody hopped on. That was really the only way to get around. Private automobiles just didn't exist in the late 19th century. You had your carriages, but people used public transit. We hit the mid part of the 20th century where it began to go downhill. It began to separate out. If you had other options, you chose those options over public transit. But as we've seen in this last sort of decade, it's returning back to large public good. So people are choosing, and New York City is a great example. The subway is at its largest ridership since World War II. People are coming on. In fact, we're now looking at there not being enough capacity in the base system. So we're having to think about how you use new technologies to sort of make transit both work better. So there are things like the Alstom model and the high-speed trains, or here in New York, new signal systems. But it's also about information sharing. So how do you make it more comfortable? If you know the transit system, if you live here, use it every day, you know your routes, you know your buses. But if you're more of an occasional user, or if you're going to a different part of the city, new technology allows you to access transit better. So we think of things like the contactless payment, smart payment technologies, so open standard payments where you can use your smartphone, you can use your credit card. You don't necessarily need a particular payment vehicle, like in some cities a token, a metal token, or even a particular smart card. You've really got a lot more options. It's easy. You can take that obviously to the Google Transits or the other transit apps that allow you to access this information. So even if you don't know where the route is, you actually have that information, because otherwise a bus, you don't necessarily know where it's all going. And then finally, I guess for a lot of it is trying to bring all of that together. So your payment technology, your next vehicle, your transit or your transit planning into sort of a unified app. So we've seen places like in Finland where they've actually taken that next step. So you bring it as, you package it together as a mobility product. So instead of having to figure out whether you take car sharing, whether you're going to use transit, whether you're going to use a bike share, bringing it all together in terms of centralized information. I think for the transit, we're getting there. A lot of those individual packets are available today, and transit agencies are rolling them out. But the next sort of phase is to bring this all, make it more ubiquitous, bring it together. We're seeing some of that start in certain cities, but that's going to be, I think, the next way for transit really to access new markets, to make it, to get people maybe instead of just being comfortable with a subway, you see on the map where it is, getting more people on the buses, trying to reduce, in the case of New York City, some of the reduction in bus ridership. Making it easier to use is going to be the critical part for smart cities, and how you bring the technology and the infrastructure and bringing them together in a unified space.
Great. A lot of talk at this conference about automatic driving applications, a lot of talk everywhere about that issue, and transport telematics. So let's get into it. How is travel demand being disrupted and or transformed by these innovations in transit? Andy?
It's a good question. So who's heard of mobility as a service? I mean, that was touched on with sort of Helsinki. That's the sort of the panacea, the sort of end goal where we want to try and bring everything together and sort of solve all of these issues. But long before mobility as a service became the buzzword, sort of Cubic's been sort of focusing on what we call our next city vision, which is really about how we start to bring all of these solutions together under a sort of common vision to really solve some of the important transport problems. And what we're doing is sort of breaking down those barriers between the sort of different modes of transport, and by bringing them together and allowing the user to seamlessly pay for all of these sort of different options or plan for these different options, gives them the ability to remove the friction from their journey. And if you remove the friction from the journey, you see greater uptake in the way people actually want to utilize the system. So much as you want to try and push people, you know, away from subways or trying to get them to use the buses more, one of the key factors of doing that is to try and make it as simple as possible. And those sort of contactless cards, mobile applications, that's something that we see as definitely the way forward and something we want to promote. But it's about how we can incentivize people to switch between modes, how to use those modal shifts to the benefit of the whole city, how to move that demand to match the capacity that's available. So for example, we have the Clipper card out in the Bay Area.
Right.
And we have a park and ride scheme there. So it's a case of you can use the sort of Clipper card to pay for your park and ride. And then if you get on the transit, we know you've used the transit, so we'll charge you a certain amount. So how can we start looking at, you know, offering reductions and incentives to use certain schemes in combination?
That's right.
That's one of the major sort of focuses of where we're going now. And if you look at the sort of new scheme that we're sort of deploying down in Miami now, which is a sort of Microsoft Azure cloud-based, account-based system, it gives us the ability to offer some real benefits to the actual traveling public. So we can start looking at using sort of federal tax credits and applying those in the back office, so you don't have to worry about sort of using a certain card for payment for this, for that. We can start maybe start looking at systems such as they have in London, where they have fare capping, where if you use the bus system 10 times in a day, we're not going to charge you sort of for 10 bus rides and charge you £27 or something. We'll just charge you for a day pass. And it's having that sort of technology.
How big is that Oyster card program in London?
Oh, it's big. So it's just like, it's a sort of phenomenal program. It's sort of been growing constantly over the years. And because ever since we introduced the sort of ability to use contactless bank cards as well to sort of bring people into the system, we've seen a massive increase. So when you arrive at Heathrow Airport, you just know that you've got to get your contactless card out, tap it, go, and you're in the system.
Yeah.
It really strips out a lot of the hassle and a lot of the friction. And we've seen, I think it's almost
like
100 different
how many
countries.
transactions a day is that carrying? Do you know?
Off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you. I know we process sort of 50 million transactions a day over all of our sort of different customers.
I think it's 10 or 11, but it's phenomenal.
It's a lot. I don't think it's as much as New York itself, but it's a significant amount.
Right.
So yeah, it's all about sort of using the technology, using the mobile applications, using the sort of account-based systems that we have in the background to really sort of be able to influence and energize people's use of the public transportation system.
Robert.
Thank you. So I think you heard in the previous session about the Port Authority. We manage the bridges, tunnels, and connections between New York and New Jersey. We run the airports. We run a train system, the path that connects Newark to Lower Manhattan and Midtown Manhattan, and the ports of commerce for Brooklyn and New Jersey, and as well as the World Trade Center. So one of the things that before we get to a fully autonomous level 5, stress-free, crash-free commute into work every morning, we really need solutions for those level 0 and level 1 cars that are out on the roads today. And especially in light of congestion and the fact that the Port Authority has passed a $32 billion capital program, about 6% of it is towards technology type projects. That's going to cause a lot of construction, and that's going to cause some disruption into the traffic network. And so we need solutions to address that. And so that's one of the reasons why the Port Authority has announced an agreement we have with Waze in order to share some of the back-end traffic data. So the agreement gives the Port Authority access to this real-time traffic that is generated by the hundreds of thousands of users that are out on our transit network. And it's helping us to better manage the traffic network. And I'll give you an example. You heard about LaGuardia. Some of you probably flew into LaGuardia. So there's a massive program right now, and we're rebuilding the central terminal building while the airport remains in continuous operation over the next several years. So there are many changes that are going on to the road network, to the buildings. Buildings are disappearing. And so we've worked very closely with the Waze community, who are a fantastic set of volunteers, by the way, to update all of the maps out at LaGuardia on a weekly basis, and then sometimes on a daily basis, to be able to take the traffic changes that are happening and make them available to the Waze users today. We also put in place a on-site agency operations center, and we gave the staff there access to augmented maps of our transit network that include the camera views and the data that we collect from roadside devices, as well as the Waze data. And from this, they can send out alerts to the commuters. They can manage and work with our partner agencies, events that come up. And the most recent example we had is we sent out an alert to 325,000 users who were specifically and directly affected crossing the George Washington Bridge due to some emergency construction on an access road. So it's that kind of, solutions today that we're really looking forward to bringing forward. The other solution that we have and that we've been using to manage our traffic network is something that we call the XBL, or the exclusive bus lane. And that connects 495, which comes from the New Jersey Turnpike through the Lincoln Tunnel to the Port Authority bus terminal. It's a dedicated 2-lane bus lane that reverses flow in the evenings. So in the morning, that lane carries 50% of all of the daily commuters that come into Midtown from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. And what it does is we have there are 650 buses on a normal day, peaks at 730 buses. At 650, there's like a 6-second headway between buses, which is manageable to keep traffic flowing for human drivers.
Did you say 6-second headway?
6-second headway between buses, right.
Manually operated?
Manually operated with union drivers, I'm sure.
Wow.
So when we hit peak, it's 730 buses,
Yeah.
and that cuts the headways to about 4.9 seconds, which would be manageable with a assistant cruise control technology, partially automated, but that we're not there yet. We're working on pilots right now. By 2040, we estimate there'll be 100,000 daily commuters coming in on buses just through the Lincoln Tunnel, and that will require a 4-second headway between buses, which requires us to have some kind of automated vehicle technology, level 3 or higher, in place in order to meet that demand to keep traffic flowing.
Wow.
So we're working closely with New York City Department of Transportation on some of their connected and autonomous vehicle pilots. We actually have a demonstration next month.
When's the forecasted start for that service?
When's the forecast?
When will that be finished, that project?
Well, it'll probably never be finished.
Yes.
I'm sorry, were you talking about the airport?
I was thinking about the bus tunnel project.
Oh, so we're in design now. There was an allocation in our capital plan of $3.5 billion for reconstruction of the new bus terminal. So it'll move for sure.
It'll move. Great.
I don't think it'll be finished in the next 10 years. But.
So this is the part where we get to take out the coloring book and the crayons, and you get to tell us in words, I suppose, what do all these innovations really mean? How would you see a smart city in the future? Adam?
So I think it's going to look at our transit system is going to change. So with automated vehicles, you're going to begin to see certain routes be able to be taken over. I mean, a lot of people talk about the demand being taken by like the ride sharing, and as it moves into automated vehicles, that could shift. But at the heart of it, especially in a city like New York where you have the rail lines, nothing is going to replace a subway that can carry, like the Lexington line, 1.8 million people a day. I mean, you can put automated buses. I mean, they just can't. In fact, the Lexington line couldn't carry that many, so they had to build the Second Avenue subway. So as we go forward, I mean, there's going to be a competition between the really base infrastructure. So here in New York, where there are literally tens of billions of dollars of hard infrastructure that's needed, that's still going to be needed, whether it's the Gateway project, whether it's the Second Avenue subway, whether it's projects like surface rail, like the BQX. You're going to need core transit routes. Where I think it's going to be really important is how the automated technology comes in to feed those. So out in the outer boroughs here, you might see in the future more automated bus lines. We, as a transit agency, need to do better. We've talked about some elements on fare payment, on different managing of vehicles. On the other hand, it also can help people visualize. So we're looking at new ways of augmented reality for the consultation phases, right? When we say we're going to build a new station, what's it going to look like? You can do visual, the whole visualization. You can give people actual feeling of what it feels like, the vibrations. There's a lot of those technologies which I think are going to help us explain how this works a lot better. Having said all this, at the end of the day, automated trains have been available since the 1980s here in New York because of the large backlog. It's going to be a number of potentially decades. I'll defer to some of the other people in those areas where to get all of the lines retrofitted even with existing technology. So, this is going to take some time. We're on the cusp of it. Obviously, automated vehicles are there. There's a smaller number of buses, and obviously streetcars or LRT vehicles are a much smaller market. So I suspect we need to be mindful of it. We need to make our systems be ready to integrate it, but we still can't forget, we can't get too excited with all this other technology when we forget that we are still going to need to keep our base system in a state of good repair. Those are going to be the trunk lines, and how we use information to allow people to access that system, and how we can update them when it comes up. We need to be mindful of it, but I think we need to be mindful of trying to get too far ahead, and when we have to forget that the base transportation system today is going to be with us for decades to come.
You find there's a lot of people who think we can skip building necessary infrastructure and just get right to the Hyperloop? I mean, Are you running into that as a project
Look, I
proponent?
mean, this is really exciting. It's fun to be at a smart cities where you can sort of envision and sort of have people push you,
Yeah.
present new sort of technologies. It's exciting. I mean, you at a center when you're planning a transit line or in a transit agency, you should be open to those and trying to incorporate them. As I said, though, at the base, like the challenges here in many, and it's not just New York, all the large cities in the United States and really around the world are trying to figure out even how do you deal with moving large numbers of people. And yes, technology is going to be a huge part of it. At the end of the day, we can't skip some of the basics. So yes, I'm very excited. Yes, we're going to use those.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, we can't, this isn't going to solve all of our transportation needs. We're going to have to remember some of the basics as well.
By the way, Vancouver is home to the world's largest automated rapid transit system, known as SkyTrain. We opened the first section of that in 1986. And it's been expanded 5 times, 5 different lines, and it's a totally driverless, intermediate capacity, elevated at grade and tunneled light rail system. So they've been around. They just they have not been embraced in as many locations as I think the original developers thought. Robert, what is your what's in your coloring book for the city of the future? What does it look? What does it look like?
I think in a lot of ways the transit system for smart cities, and I'll say this is a really exciting time to be in infrastructure. We have an opportunity to pass on the legacy that our grandparents gave us to our grandchildren if we do it right and we hold to our convictions. And we bring some art to it, which is another thing I'd like to mention. There's so much focus on practicality and making things work. I think there needs to be a little space for making things beautiful and exciting and interesting. I mean, this space is just a tremendous example of repurposing of the built environment for something modern. But in a lot of ways, I think the transit system is returning to a model that would be recognizable from someone from the 1930s and 40s. Streetcars, ferries, cars, buses. I mean, all of this it's the same as what it was nearly 100 years ago. Yeah. But the difference is the expectations are so much higher. People ask for and deserve a system that is much more responsive to what the demand is placed upon it, that is adaptive to weather and events and is resilient. And I think they also expect and deserve better options for people with mobility, vision, and hearing restrictions. So much about technology is focused on the minimum viable product, right? And I'm tired of hearing that because I'm tired of buying things that aren't really up to snuff. So engage all 5 senses, but think about people who aren't blessed with all 5 senses as you're putting your apps together and from a technology perspective. But and I think this is part of the rebirth of these vintage transit systems into the modern digital era. People need real-time schedules, real-time performance data. They need to have the physical and technical security that reflect the realities of the world that we're in. And I think for this, trying to reconcile, Robert Moses and his legacy, which we've inherited with Jane Jacobs, who is the heroine who wrote The Death and Birth of American Cities. If you haven't read it, you should read it. There's also a biopic that just came out about her. So reconciling that for us means for rail, for example, the Port Authority is implementing positive train control on the PATH system, and we're doing it by December of 2018. This is something that is required for us to meet our federal guidelines, but it's also an opportunity because we're replacing a 104-year-old signaling system. So if you don't know what positive train control is, it's kind of like vehicle-assisted braking, but for trains, and it keeps trains from crashing into each other. It's also going to give us the ability to improve our capacity on the PATH system by 20%, and will reduce the headways between trains from 6 minutes to 3 minutes, which means less dwell time on the platform for PATH users. Also for us, it means something that I haven't talked about in public before, but it's a thing called Perfect Connect. So if you flew into LaGuardia, for example, Perfect Connect is an attempt for us to work with the airlines to get real-time passenger arrival information and link it up with local transportation modalities. So we can flow the network transit providers like the Ubers and the Lyfts of the world, and our taxi systems and our public ways with all of the people who are coming into our different airports. And we think because we know who's arriving, how long it takes you to transit through the terminal, what your dwell time is for baggage, we should be able to figure out analytically how many taxis are needed, how many buses are needed, so on and so forth. So we're partnering with the airlines on that right now. So,
music to all the ears of the travelers in the room, I'm sure. Okay, our last question will really be, we're going to talk a little bit about people. If smart cities are powered by people, how can we better integrate with the very people that need to use our offering in the development and in the process around creating the innovations that are required for this? Scott, you want to take a run at this?
Sure, it's a good question. My problem, my concern with transportation is it's miserable today, right?
Yeah.
So we're all very comfortable at home. We're fairly comfortable in our offices or wherever we choose to work. But getting to places, particularly in cities, is a miserable experience. And for some reason in America, in Canada, we've accepted that. We haven't gone to our politicians. We haven't gone to policymakers. We haven't gone to the think tanks. We don't go to you guys enough, right? And complain. Why do we suffer? So the question we wrestle with is how to make the passenger experience better, how to have a sense of entitlement that transportation should be fluid, transportation should be comfortable, we should be able to experience it with all 5 senses. Because if we're able to build transportation networks and multimodal transportation networks, I completely agree. Let's dream about Hyperloop. Let's dream about autonomous vehicles. But they're going to take time. The thing that people miss is transportation is, in technical terms, the way we look at it, a vital system. If there's a failure, if there's a problem, people can't die. People can't be hurt. The big problems with cars today is they're not vital, and that's why people get hurt all the time. But when it comes to trains, the intent is for it to be a vital system where people don't get hurt. The same thing with autonomous vehicles. So as we move to vitality in these other modes, and it takes a really long time to get there, we need to make sure that the existing modes become more comfortable, offer a better passenger experience, and we make sure people, our politicians, our elected officials, they understand that we deserve better, more comfortable transportation. I think we also need to shift the discussion more to better asset utilization. To me, one of the benefits of transit is you free up public space for better public use. Why are we laying down new roads? Why are we utilizing vital infrastructure and space for non-livable parks, for commercial real estate, for residential real estate? If you can free up real estate by better deploying transportation assets, it's better for people. And the other thing is, I think we need to have an honest discussion about what autonomous vehicles are. Autonomous vehicles provide mobility, but they're also providing better asset utilization. It's a waste for each of us to own a car, and I don't know what the statistics are on it, but use it for less than 50% of the time, less than 30% of the time. I don't know what the actual utilization rate is. We're filling up parking lots for 5%. Assets that aren't used. So if it is truly asset optimization on an autonomous vehicle, let's discuss it in that terms. And when we talk about mobility, you can't shrink cars enough to fill up roads with technology that has them running nose to nose and still move enough people. You need trains, you need buses, you need other modes of transportation. So shift the dialogue so that people want us to feel that having pleasurable transportation is a right, not a like. Look at asset utilization and make sure that assets, whether it be real estate, whether it be parking lots, whatever they are eliminated so that we can better have available assets. And let's recognize that the multimodal approach is the approach that we need to be successful.
Thanks. And maybe Andy, you want to?
Yeah, sure. How long have we got?
3 minutes.
Okay, I'll talk quick.
3 minutes before the hook comes out.
So we're talking about people and trying to get people to engage and use public transportation. The only way you're going to do it is by sort of giving them the information that they need. So it's great having new trains, it's great having new bus routes, it's great having the Second Avenue subway, and people will use it. There was a report by NYU that basically showed the big shift from for hire vehicles to the Second Avenue subway when it opened. Fantastic. But unless you actually give the people the right information they need to make informed decisions, you're not going to go anywhere fast. I go through that same old ritual every time where I want to travel, and I'll open up Google Maps, I'll tell it where I'm going to go, and it'll tell me, like Tuesday for example, I wanted to get back to Brooklyn, and he said take the A line, go here, the next train's at 4:57, and then there's a big yellow sign that says caution, delays. And you're thinking, oh great, is that sort of 10 minutes, 15, 30 minutes, whatever. I had no idea, so I thought, well, I've got my usual 200 emails to sort of wade through, so I'll go down to the platform anyway. And as soon as I got there, the train turned up. There was no delays, there was no sort of impact on the service for that particular part of the route. Now I know the sort of transit agencies have that information, so why can't that information be pushed out to the actual users? Give them real-time information to allow them to have confidence in the system, to allow them to sort of make more informed decisions. And then when you've got them engaged in an application, when they've bought into using the application and using the real-time information, that's when you can incentivize people through coupons or whatever, or gamification to basically try and shift their patterns. So yes, we've got a big sort of demand on the networks and stuff, but if we can do something to maybe delay somebody's journey by 20 minutes or something, by giving them a coupon for a cup of coffee, or giving them the latest version of Candy Crush where they can sort of play in a certain area for a certain time and get free transit credits or something, we can use that to sort of really shift patterns. And that sort of shifting a pattern can really make a big impact on the demand and really sort of help better match that demand capacity issue within the transit system.
Well, we have 1 minute left. And I just want to thank everyone for your attention. As you may have learned, transit might be an old business, but it's going to be around for a long time. It's not going to be replaced by anything anytime soon. And in fact, it's growing at a rate that is unprecedented. Cities want more of it, people want more of it, they want it to be better, they want it to be faster, they want it to be friendlier. And if you're looking for a career change, come on up, because this is one unbelievably fascinating field of public policy and technology and people. So I thank you all very much for your attention, and I thank the panel as well.
Thank you.